Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Kaufman. I'm CEO of Sovereignty International. We're involved in international issues such as the global warming climate change issue, trying to understand exactly what's going on both sides of the issue. In fact, we think it's extremely important that policymakers and the people that are involved fully understand both sides of an issue before policy is actually formulated. Tragically, that's not happening in the global warming issue. We're only seeing one side of this issue being presented, and it's the fact that man supposedly is causing global warming. What we hope to do here today is to examine the other side and show you the evidence and this from the scientists themselves that global warming is not necessarily caused by man. In fact, the overwhelming evidence, we believe, is that it's a part of a natural cycle. One of the ways that we can do this is to contrast what Al Gore says in his Inconvenient Truth with what other scientists are actually saying.
This is not a normal time. We are facing a planetary emergency. The relationship between humankind and planet Earth has been radically altered in a very short period of time. And what would make us believe that we could go through these changes and not have an impact? Our impact on the planet has been dramatically changed. We're capable of doing damage that we're not always fully aware that we're doing. The 10 hottest years ever measured in the record have been since 1990. 20 of the 21 hottest years have been in the last 25 years. The hottest year of all was 2005. The hottest year of all in the U.S. was 2006. The hottest winter ever measured worldwide was this winter, December, and then January and February of this year, last month. This is going on right now, and it's continuing to increase.
The document from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they've set records all over America in January, 183 cold records, 183 of them. This is a new record all over America.
Good evening, everyone. We begin with a spring chill that is extending tonight from the Northeast to Texas, threatening to put many a holiday observance on ice. After a mild early winter, it's looking like Easter could turn out to be colder in some parts than it was at Christmas. Here's NBC's Ron Allen.
Many cities haven't been this cold this time of year in 20 years, forecasters say. And before that, for some places, it's back another 100 years. It felt more like Christmas holiday weather than Easter, especially in the East, where Washington's cherry blossoms were especially white. The boys of summer threw snowballs instead of baseballs in Cleveland again today, after Friday's opening day game was snowed out.
Unfortunately, the weather is unseasonably cold to the point of maybe 40 to 50 degrees below normal temperature-wise across portions of the, let's say, west central and north central Texas. The eastern two-thirds of the country well below normal.
Many things we thought we knew about the climate system just a few years ago are now proving to be highly uncertain or quite mistaken.
For whatever reason, right now, it becomes quite newsworthy to go out and tell people that we are about to have apocalyptic climate changes. And the second you make that pronouncement, it's easy to go around the world and find examples to support your viewpoint. But it would have always been easy. There would be no time in Earth history when you would not have been able to go around the world and find damaging hurricanes and tornadoes and whatever. They are not linked to the buildup of greenhouse gases.
When people say we don't believe in global warming, I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
You can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
They have not established that greenhouse gases are warming the Earth.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It is entirely political.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them. And none of them are asked to agree. Many of them disagree. That since no scientist disagrees, you shouldn't disagree either. But then, whenever you hear that in science, that's pure propaganda.
This cuts right at the heart of national sovereignty of the United States of America. We, in essence, would be saying we would allow an international body to come in and dictate to our industries, our businesses, our people, what they could do and what they couldn't do. Use of what energy, which sources of energy, the cost of energy.
This is an awakening call that we are facing a battle against those that want to destroy a great United States of America.
All these treaties are dangerous attacks on American freedoms, national security, land ownership, and private property. Every one of these treaties involves setting up a new global bureaucracy that would have some kind of obnoxious control over American citizens, or our families, or our schools, or our businesses, or our use of natural resources and energy, or our land. And together they add up to what is meant by global governance.
Yes, Senator, it's a global problem and it has to be solved with a global strategy. But this is the rare but all-important global or strategic problem. Its aspect is in the global dimension, and every nation has to be a part of the solution.
I used to agree with these dramatic warnings of climate disaster. I taught my students that most of the increase in temperature of the past century was due to human contributions of CO2. The association seemed so clear and simple. Increases of greenhouse gases were driving us towards a climate catastrophe. However, a few years ago I decided to look more closely at the science, and it astonished me. In fact, there is no evidence of humans being the cause. There is, however, overwhelming evidence of natural causes, such as changes in the output of the sun. This has completely reversed my views on the Kyoto Protocol. Actually, many other leading climate researchers also have serious concerns about the science underlying the protocol. So let's hear what you're not being told about climate change.
The major premise of the inconvenient truth is that carbon dioxide is the major greenhouse gas that drives the temperature of the Earth.
They can go back 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside.
The ice core data comes from ice cores drilled to a depth of nearly 12,000 feet, or 2.2 miles, at the Vostok Station in Antarctica. Like Mr. Gore, the United Nations uses this information to prove that Earth's CO2 and temperature are highly correlated. And they are right. However, a high correlation proves nothing. To give an extreme example, there is a 100% correlation that any human that breathes air will die. But that does not prove that breathing air kills people. Far from it. We would all die if we didn't breathe air. But even the correlation used by Mr. Gore and the United Nations is misleading. Notice they kept the two graphs separate. By doing so, the human eye perceives that CO2 causes temperature to rise. However, when the temperature graph is superimposed over the CO2 graph, it becomes apparent that CO2 tends to follow temperature, not precede it, strongly suggesting that the CO2 does not cause the temperature to change, but the temperature causes CO2 to change. This point was made extremely well by London, England's Channel 4 in a documentary they produced called The Great Global Warming Swindle.
Well, here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
Humans produce a small fraction in the single digits percentage-wise of the CO2 that is produced in the atmosphere.
Of the 210 billion metric tons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere each year, humans contribute only 6.3 billion tons, or about 3%. Other sources like vegetation, soils, and the ocean dwarf the amount produced by man. The importance of carbon dioxide is diminished even further by the never-mentioned fact that the overwhelming majority of all greenhouse gases is water vapor and clouds. Water vapor comprises approximately 97% of all greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide comprises less than 2%, and the balance is made up of methane, chlorofluorocarbons, and nitrous oxide. Many proponents of man-caused global warming claim that water vapor is highly variable across the Earth and from season to season, and therefore is unimportant. Additionally, they claim that CO2 has far greater potential as a greenhouse gas than a small amount would otherwise indicate. While there is some truth in these claims, water vapor remains the dominant greenhouse gas. The effectiveness or potential of greenhouse gases is highly variable due to a host of reasons. At any one time, water vapor accounts for 36 to 70% of the total greenhouse gas effects. If clouds are included, it jumps to 66 to 86%. Carbon dioxide comes in a distant third by accounting for only 9 to 27%. And remember, man's activities accounts for less than 3% of the total carbon dioxide, so at a maximum, man is responsible for less than 1% of all the potential greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We see the greenhouse power of water vapor every day. Temperatures in the desert can easily reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit during the day in the summer. During the night, desert temperatures can easily drop down to 65 degrees, a drop of 45 degrees. The change is so large because of the very low water vapor in the desert. Conversely, because the humid deep south has high levels of water vapor, daytime temperatures rarely go over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and drop to only 80 degrees at night, a difference of only 20 degrees. That represents a 25-degree difference between the deserts and the humid areas in day-night temperatures, all due to the amount of water vapor. We also see the greenhouse effect of clouds on a regular basis. The temperature may drop to 50 degrees at night when it is clear, but remains at 65 degrees at night when it's cloudy, a difference of 15 degrees or more between clear and cloudy weather. The greenhouse power of water vapor and clouds dwarfs that of carbon dioxide. And remember, only a tiny amount of the carbon dioxide greenhouse effect is caused by man.
In fact, if you wanted to categorize greenhouse gases, to paraphrase a colleague of mine, he says that greenhouse gas number 1, 2, 3, and 4 is water vapor, with carbon dioxide would be a distant 5. CO2 has an influence, but it's certainly not significant enough for us to worry about.
More likely, the warming is part of a natural cycle that has been ongoing for millennia.
The paleoclimatic data that I and others have collected, it's obvious that climate is and always has been variable. In fact, the only constant about climate is change. It changes continually.
Past climate researchers have found that over much of the world between about 1400 and in some places as late as 1900, there was a period of colder than average temperature over the world called the Little Ice Age. And before that, there was a period of unusual warmth called the medieval optimal, or warm period. So warming and cooling are part of the norm. The 20th century is not out of balance compared to the past.
So that created a very familiar curve that appeared in the early IPCC reports. And then suddenly, in 1998, a study came out, which is now referred to as the MBH 98, because the three authors' names, the first one is the one that's spoken about the most, which is Mann, published a report in which they completely rejected that widely accepted temperature graph.
The MBH98 graph became known as the hockey stick curve, where the shaft of the stick was the relatively constant lower temperatures for the first 900 years of the past millennium, and the blade of the stick the reputed sudden temperature rise of the past century. Although man's research was never audited, the United Nations and environmentalists promoted it as the smoking gun that recent warming was unusual. Analyst Stephen McIntyre, in cooperation with Ross McKittrick of the University of Guelph, decided to take a closer look at the data.
We carried out an analysis of the results to see what happened when we recompiled the data, and got quite different answers. Instead of having an extraordinarily high 20th century, we had a 15th century value that was just as high as the 20th century. So the hockey stick disappeared. It's a computer programming error that yields these hockey sticks. This piece of the jigsaw puzzle needs to be removed before science can develop a proper understanding of the climate history of the last millennium.
Here's a study that appeared in the world's top science journal, and yet years went by and they never noticed that the data description that accompanied the paper was wrong, that there were very important methodological issues that weren't described in the paper.
McIntyre and McKendrick noted that the graph using the corrected data could still be wrong because the methodology used in the MBH 98 was fundamentally incorrect. They wrote in geophysical research letters that, quote, the effect of the transformation is so strong that a hockey stick-shaped PC1 curve is almost always generated from a trendless red noise with the persistent properties of the North American tree ring network, unquote. In other words, when McIntyre and McKendrick analyzed random data using MBH 98 methodology, out popped a hockey stick every time. The McIntyre-McKendrick report generated so much controversy that the U.S. Congress authorized the National Academy of Sciences to study and report on the issue. The National Academy essentially supported the McIntyre-McKendrick report by warning that the methodology used in MBH 98 should not be used for this type of research because it, quote, tends to bias the shape of the reconstructions, unquote. Although the report also criticized other aspects of the MBH 98, it did so in a very apologetic manner, leading the media to proclaim that the National Academy actually supported MBH 98. Separate from the National Academy, the Energy and Commerce Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives commissioned 3 prominent statisticians, chaired by an eminent statistics professor, Edward Wegman, chairman of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Committee on Theoretical and Applied Statistics, to review both the MBH 98 and the McIntyre-McKendrick critique. The Wigman report found that, quote, while the work of Mackelman and colleagues presents what appears to be compelling evidence of global temperature change, the criticisms of McIntyre and McKendrick, as well as those of other authors mentioned, are indeed valid. We found that the MBH 98 to be somewhat obscure and incomplete, and the criticisms of McIntyre and McKendrick to be valid and compelling, unquote. In spite of this, Al Gore prominently displays the hockey stick in Inconvenient Truth, as does the 2004 Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, making both highly suspect. Dr. Vincent Gray, a chemist and IPCC expert reviewer, shares his concerns about why the discredited hockey stick continues to be used.
They made up what they were going to do beforehand and then chose whatever science they could find, which they thought might support it. That's my view. They had another scare a few years ago because one of the people from the IPCC went on an Arctic cruise, you see, and he was absolutely amazed to find there was open sea. And he put an article in the New York Times saying, you know, this proves global warming. He had failed to notice that the Northwest Passage was first negotiated by a man called Roald Amundsen in 1906.
Recent research shows that 8,000 years ago, temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees higher in the Arctic than today, and that dramatic changes occurred in only a few decades. Nevertheless, polar bears and other Arctic wildlife obviously adapted and survived, and so are also not threatened today.
About 5,000 years ago, the world was much warmer than it is today, and warmer even than they're forecasting for the most extreme global warming forecasts.
A common misconception amongst the general public is that temperatures are rapidly increasing. This is only with some of the surface data, and it's selected surface data. In fact, if much of the surface data that's collected is from around urban areas or areas which have had significant land use change, and this data is contaminated. On the other hand, satellites provide comprehensive coverage of the Earth, 24/7, for the last 20 years. And so what they have demonstrated is that there has been an almost imperceptible rise in temperature over this time.
But is there really much difference between temperatures in cities and that of the rest of the world?
I did studies in Winnipeg 25 years ago. We were measuring the heat island of the city of Winnipeg, and we found as much as 10 degrees Celsius difference between Portage and Maine, which is supposedly the coldest part of Winnipeg, and the airport 8 kilometers away.
Most cities of the world have hotter temperatures than the surrounding countryside. That has nothing to do with carbon dioxide and everything to do with land use. Modern cities have concrete buildings with asphalt roofs that generate heat, which creates artificial heat that elevates the temperature that doesn't really reflect the true climate.
We have balloons that go up through the atmosphere twice each day from locations around the world, and they're in near perfect agreement with the satellite record.
What about the relatively warm year 1998? Was that global warming or a naturally occurring event, such as El Nino?
In 1997-98, we had a major El Nino develop at low latitude, and there was a tremendous amount of water vapor pumped up in the atmosphere, and we had a 1 degree Celsius spike around the world that was noted at that time that disappeared within a few months.
It's not even 25 years ago that the great threat was global cooling. You go back to the 70s and 76, and people like Ponte publishing books called The Cooling, and the scientific consensus then was that we were headed for cooling.
A quote from Newsweek magazine. Now listen to this. This is a quote. It says, "There are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically, and that these changes may portend a drastic decline in food production with serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth." Second, a headline in the New York Times reads, "Climate changes endanger world's food output." Here's another quote from Time magazine. "As they review the bizarre and unpredictable weather pattern of the past several years, a growing number of scientists are beginning to suspect that many seemingly contradictory meteorological fluctuations are actually part of a global climate upheaval." All this sounds very ominous. That is until you realize that the 3 quotes I just read were from articles in 1975, editions of Newsweek magazine and the New York Times, and of Time magazine in 1974. They weren't referring to global warming. They were warning of a coming ice age. So the same people who were hysterical back then are using the same words to describe what's happening today. Let me repeat. All 3 of those quotes were published in the 1970s, warning of a coming ice age. Another ice age is coming. We're all going to die.
Senator Inhofe also condemns the one-sided coverage and near-religious zeal by the media of reporting man-caused global warming during a December 6, 2006 Senate hearing.
Much of the mainstream media has subverted its role as an objective source of information on climate change into a role of an advocate. We've seen examples of this overwhelmingly. One-sided reporting by 60 Minutes reporter Scott Pelley, ABC's Bill Blakemore, CNN's Miles O'Brien, which I believe is here with us today or will be, Time Magazine, the Associated Press, Reuters, just to name a few. A report in August of 2006 from the UK's Labour-leaning Institute for Public Policy Research also slammed the media presentation of climate science as, and I'm going to quote here again, this is what they said. These are people who are believers in the other side of this about man-made global warming. A quasi-religious register of doom, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, using words such as catastrophe, chaos, and havoc. The report also compared the media's coverage of global warming to, quote, the unreality of Hollywood films. Now, these are the believers we're talking about.
Senator Inhofe is correct. The media has not served the American people well on the global warming issue. As we have already seen, there are serious discrepancies in the man-caused global warming theory. Yet it's not all the media's fault. They are repeatedly told by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, that man is causing global warming. The IPCC announced its summary for policymakers during a press conference in Paris in February 2007, announcing that the science had advanced so much that they can now say that man-caused global warming is a 90% certainty.
And the scientific leaders of the world have given us the 4th unanimous report in less than 15 years. They gathered this time in Paris 6 weeks ago. And they said the evidence supporting this consensus is, and I quote them, unequivocal. Unequivocal.
We hear constantly in the media, we hear on a variety of different formats in the news media as well as on specials. Al Gore just produced his video, The Inconvenient Truth. He reaffirms time and time and time again in that video that there is no longer any debate. It's a settled science. Well, folks, it's not a settled science by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, a survey was done in 2003 of all climatologists in the world, over 500 of them, that basically said that only 56% of them actually thought man was causing it. When you get down to, is it a settled science? Is it enough to make policy formulation? That drops to 45%. Most scientists are very skeptical at this point that we should be forming policy based on what the science is showing, or at least the science that we're hearing about is showing. Almost 45% of the scientists do not believe man is causing global warming. And that's a long ways from consensus.
Most government and media get the wrong impression by only reading the summaries for policymakers. The alarmist and misleading overviews of the IPCC's science reports.
Now, this summary for policymakers isn't a summary for policymakers at all. It's a summary by policymakers. In other words, it is a summary which is agreed line by line by government representatives. The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It is entirely political.
Just how political is explained by Chris Horner of CNN's Headline News' Glenn Beck Show.
These scientists are generally assigned 1 page to a page and a half to write with one other author. They're never asked if they agree with anything else, never asked if they agree with the chapter, the underlying work, let alone the summary for policymakers, which is written by bureaucrats and politicians and pressure group lobbyists who are in one room down a hall where the lead authors of the chapters, which are compilations of these page to page and a half writings, and a runner runs back and forth telling the lead authors, the scientists, the pressure group lobbyists want you to change the following to be in harmony with the summary. Remember, this is a document that is produced generally, the summary of which is issued months before the actual underlying work is actually even written. That should tell you something. And this writing process whereby runners subject, very credentialed scientists, many of whom have dropped off, to the humiliation of having to change their underlying work to agree with something politicians want to say.
I was at a table with 3 Europeans. We were having lunch. And they were talking about their role as lead authors. And they were talking about how they were trying to make the report so dramatic that the United States would just have to sign up to the Kyoto Protocol.
Where the governments have placed all their belief in the IPCC have placed all their faith in the computer models.
General circulation models, or GCMs as we refer to them, are trying to simulate the climate of the Earth at the surface as well as through the upper atmosphere. The climate includes not only temperature and precipitation and cloud cover, but also the atmospheric winds, changes or the movement of these systems over time from one month to another, evaporation from the oceans and from the land, precipitation onto the surface, global ice, sea cover, all the aspects of the Earth, of the planet, that are related to the atmosphere and to the oceans.
It's very difficult to create a realistic computer model because the atmosphere and the surface of the Earth and the oceans and vegetation systems are all so very complex. And the ways that all of these components of the system interact are so complex. They interact in nonlinear ways, which we really can't predict. One thing changes, which changes something else, which changes something else. There's this cascade of processes.
People have to understand that the entire global climate change hysteria is driven by computer models. It is not driven by reality. Reality is not warming up like those models said it would.
There is not a computer in the world with the capacity to handle the data, but more important, to handle all of the calculations of interaction and complexities of the climate.
We frequently hear that the incidence and severity of extreme weather, such things as hurricanes, blizzards, droughts, and floods, are increasing, and that global warming is the cause.
The argument is that we're going to have an increase of drought, and it's another part of the scare tactics. Well, more severe weather, more droughts, and so on. When you look at the long-term record, what you see is that droughts are cyclical. They do alternate, but you also see there are far worse droughts in the past than we've had in the modern record.
History shows that storm frequency and intensity is greatest in colder periods. The extreme weather of the Little Ice Age provides a good example.
The storms were much more dramatic. The storms would wipe out villages and hundreds of thousands of people at a time in storms not seen since. The Thames River in England would freeze over every year, and there would be ice parties. Crop failures meant starvation and plagues were common. All in all, it was a very difficult time to live. But what about hurricanes today? Doesn't the disastrous 2005 hurricane season prove we are having more hurricanes due to global warming? Data from the National Hurricane Center tend to show just the opposite. During the 100 years from 1851 to 1950, the total number of hurricanes per decade averaged between 15 and 22, with 5 to 8 major hurricanes. The 1940 to 50 period jumped to 24 total and 10 major hurricanes. From 1951 through 2000, the average number of hurricanes declined to a total of 12 to 15, with 5 to 6 major hurricanes per decade. This is during the period when CO2 levels were escalating. Although the 2000 to 2010 period is not yet complete, the number of hurricanes appears to be only increasing to the pre-1950 level. While the 2005 season was particularly devastating, the 2006 season had no hurricanes striking the U.S. at all. Hurricane experts almost unanimously say that it's highly unlikely that global warming is increasing the frequency and the intensity of hurricanes.
In our view, they're well within nature's variation.
Recent research at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has demonstrated that global warming may actually increase wind shear over the tropical waters of the Atlantic and Eastern Pacific tropical zones, much like what happened in the 2006 El Niño year when no hurricanes struck the United States at all. Wind shear can keep hurricanes from forming, intensifying, or even cause them to disorganize. This NOAA animation shows how wind shear works. A hurricane begins to form over the central Atlantic. It then moves into the tropical zone where warm water causes it to intensify. However, if it moves into an area having wind shear, as these NOAA models are predicting will happen with global warming, the top of the hurricane is sheared off, reducing its intensity, possibly down to a tropical storm category. But there's even a more fundamental problem with the carbon dioxide greenhouse model. As depicted in this NASA animation, hurricane formation requires very warm water and a cold troposphere. Warm moist air rises and condenses into clouds. Condensation creates more warm air, causing a faster rise of the air and wind creation. The Coriolis effect causes the wind to move in a counterclockwise manner, and as the winds become stronger and stronger, they form a tropical storm and then a hurricane. These conditions existed during the violent season of 2005 that favored the creation of hurricanes like Katrina, Rita, and many others. Many believe that since the ocean surface temperatures and the air layer will get warmer with global warming, more tropical storms and severe hurricanes will result, like occurred in 2005. But that is not how carbon dioxide warming happens. Al Gore does have this part of the theory correct.
You know it well. The sun's radiation comes in the form of light waves, and that heats up the Earth. And then some of the radiation that is absorbed and warms the Earth is re-radiated back into space in the form of infrared radiation. And some of the outgoing infrared radiation is trapped by this layer of atmosphere and held inside the atmosphere. And that's a good thing because it keeps the temperature of the Earth within certain boundaries, keeps it relatively constant and livable. But the problem is this thin layer of atmosphere is being thickened by all of the global warming pollution that's being put up there. And what that does is it thickens this layer of atmosphere. More of the outgoing infrared is trapped. And so the atmosphere heats up worldwide. That's global warming.
That is what should happen if carbon dioxide was really causing global warming. The problem is, that is not what's happening in the real world. Scientists interviewed by Channel 4 in London, England, explain why.
If it's greenhouse warming,
you get more warming in the middle of the troposphere, the first 10, 12 kilometers of the atmosphere, than you do at the surface. There are good theoretical reasons for that, having to do with how the greenhouse works.
All the models, every one of them, calculates that the warming should be faster as you go up from the surface into the atmosphere. And in fact, the maximum warming over the equator should take place at an altitude of about 10 kilometers.
So instead of increasing the temperature gradient, which would cause more frequent and severe storms and hurricanes, the global warming theory states that the gradient should decline, thereby decreasing, not increasing, the frequency and the severity of storms and hurricanes.
What we found consistently is that in a great part of the planet, that the bulk of the atmosphere is not warming as much as we see at the surface in this region. And that's a real head scratcher for us, because the theory is pretty straightforward. And the theory says that if the surface warms, the upper atmosphere should warm rapidly. The rise in temperature of that part of the atmosphere is not very dramatic at all, and really does not match the theory that climate models are expressing at this point.
That is, the observations do not show an increase with altitude. In fact, most observations show a slight decrease in the rate of warming with altitude. So in a sense, you can say that the hypothesis of man-made global warming is falsified by the evidence.
Man-caused global warming proponents also claim that because the North Pole is melting, polar bears are threatened with extinction. However, numerous studies have shown that all but one of the many polar bear populations are stable or increasing. Polar bears have managed to survive just fine through many other periods in the past 10,000 years in which it was much warmer than even the most pessimistic global warming predictions today. But what about the Antarctic and Greenland? Won't their melting cause massive shoreline flooding?
It's considered relatively more stable, however, than another big body of ice that's roughly the same size. Greenland would also raise sea level almost 20 feet if it went. If Greenland broke up and melted, or if half of Greenland and half of West Antarctica broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida. This is what would happen to San Francisco Bay. A lot of people live in these areas.
Even the highly political United Nations IPCC states in their 2007 summary for policymakers that the most that will happen by the 21st century is 59 centimeters or 23 inches. The only possible reason that Al Gore would use such a blatant distortion of truth would be to create a sense of raw fear in the video's viewers. Tragically, the inconvenient truth has been repeatedly shown to thousands of naive elementary and high school students who have little to no basis to judge the merits of what they are watching. Not only is Al Gore's assessment extremely exaggerated, but there is compelling evidence that many parts of Antarctica are getting colder, and the center of Greenland's ice cap is actually growing, not melting. The evidence for Greenland is quite dramatic. On July 15, 1942, 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 6 P-38 Lightnings flying from the United States to England were forced to make an emergency landing on Greenland's southern ice cap. The crew was rescued, but the planes were left on the ice. In 1988, Pat Epps and Richard Taylor led a team to find these missing planes. They expected to find them within 40 feet of the surface. They did not. After several years of failure, the planes were finally found in 1992. 1 mile from the landing site and 268 feet below the ice surface. The team used hot water to dig a tunnel down to one of the planes to extract it. Dubbed the Glacier Girl, the plane was restored and is now flying again. The planes did not sink to a depth of 268 feet, nor did the glacier push them down to that depth. If that were the case, the planes would have been ripped apart. Rather, 268 feet of ice accumulated on them from 1941 to 1992. Although the results are complex, other research shows that much of Greenland's interior ice cap is growing, and only its edges are melting. In balance, there is only a slight decline for the entire continent. Al Gore ignores all this and concentrates instead on the melting that is occurring on the edges of Greenland.
10 years later, this is what happened. And here's the melting from 2005.
Should we be alarmed about this melting? 800 years ago, the Earth was considerably warmer than it is today. The Vikings settled in southern Greenland and prospered in an agrarian culture. That period is known as the medieval optimal or medieval warm period, and the Vikings grew crops where much of the melting is occurring today. By 1400, when the temperature was about what it is today, the climate had become so cold that the Vikings had to abandon many of their settlements. If these same Vikings were here today, they would undoubtedly tell us that this warming is not such a bad thing.
When the Vikings were sailing in Arctic waters, and when the Vikings were farming in Greenland in soil that's now permanently frozen, the question is then what caused that warming? It certainly wasn't human-produced CO2.
The answer may be in the sun. It has been known for centuries that there is a relationship between the number of sunspots and the Earth's temperature. The more sunspots, the warmer the Earth's temperature. It has recently been determined that the more sunspots there are, the more energy the sun emits. However, the increased energy is not sufficient to account for the warming of the Earth. That discovery encouraged the theory that the sun could not cause warming and that carbon dioxide must be the driving force. While direct changes in solar energy output may not be sufficient to cause the warming, there seems to be other factors at work. It has been known for some time that there is a high correlation between the length of the solar cycle and the Earth's temperature. An emerging theory seems to fit all the data and offers a far better explanation for the current warming than greenhouse gases. It has been known since the 20th century that there appears to be a correlation between cosmic radiation and low elevation cloudiness. The more cosmic radiation, the more cloud formation. Several Danish scientists led by Hendrik Sevensmark confirmed that relation in the early 1990s and found the correlation to be highly significant. They then developed a working hypothesis. When a sun goes supernova, it emits a burst of cosmic radiation. As that radiation reaches the Earth thousands of years later, it interacts with atmospheric atoms and frees electrons, which then act to bring water vapor molecules together, which finally condenses out into water droplets in the lower atmosphere, which creates clouds. Low elevation clouds are highly reflective and reflect the sun's energy back out into space. The more clouds, the more sun is reflected, and the less solar energy actually gets to the Earth to warm it, and the Earth's temperature drops. As long as the cosmic rays are bombarding the Earth in high amounts, there will be greater cloud formation, greater solar reflectance, and cooler global temperatures. However, as the sun becomes more active with solar flares and other activity, plasma made up of charged particles of mainly electrons and protons called solar winds stream out from the sun. While this has many effects on the Earth, it keeps more of the cosmic radiation from reaching the Earth and other planets, thereby reducing cloud formation. With fewer low-altitude clouds, more of the sun's energy reaches the Earth's surface where it causes heating and a warming Earth. The effect is huge. In just 5 years, it can cause a 2% decrease in clouds, which in turn equates to an increase in surface warming equivalent to about 85% of what is claimed for all carbon dioxide warming since the Industrial Revolution. In addition, Mars and other planets in the solar system also appear to be experiencing global warming, just like Earth. Although the theory is in hot debate within the scientific community, this evidence supports the solar-caused global warming theory and further weakens the carbon dioxide greenhouse gas theory. Elevated levels of carbon dioxide may not be as harmful as Al Gore and other man-caused global warming proponents would have us believe. In fact, there is strong evidence that elevated carbon dioxide may be very beneficial, something that we are never told.
I mean, CO2 has been part of the planetary atmosphere since the first day this Earth evolved. And the plants and virtually everything we see evolved in a period of time when the CO2 level was very much higher than it is today. CO2 is something the plants love. They take up CO2, they use it, they give out oxygen. We take the oxygen and give out CO2. So it's hardly a pollutant at all. It's quite a naturally occurring gas that appears in our atmosphere and is very important to sustaining life on this Earth.
In terms of the broad geological perspective, the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere right now is low. Almost all the plants that we live with and depend upon for food evolved in an atmosphere when the CO2 was higher in the atmosphere, much higher than it is today, and higher than we could possibly get it even if we tried.
Well, as a matter of fact, there were times when life flourished on Earth. The time when CO2 levels were something like 10 times current levels was when the dinosaurs were running around.
If carbon dioxide levels were 10 or more times what they are today, where did it all go? A look at how carbon is distributed today provides an easy answer. The atmosphere today holds less than 800 billion metric tons of carbon, soil and vegetation over 2,000, fossil fuels 4,000, and oceans nearly 40,000. However, the greatest sink for carbon is in sedimentary rocks like limestone, which has an estimated 80 trillion metric tons of carbon that has been taken out of the atmosphere. That is 100 times the amount that is currently in the atmosphere.
Yeah, some scientists believe that 9,000 or so years ago, agriculture sprung up all over the world. We saw people domesticate plants in Southeast Asia and South America and Europe and North America, all at about the same time. And it also corresponded when the carbon dioxide levels had increased from about 200 parts per million to about 250 parts per million. And it gave agricultural plants a competitive advantage over weeds. It may be that carbon dioxide is the reason we domesticated plants.
When we've looked at the literature on experiments that have been done with increasing levels of carbon dioxide, what we basically find is that most plants respond the same way. More carbon dioxide gives us more biomass. So if we look at a forest, a rangeland, a marsh, a wetland, or an agricultural field, what's really happening with more CO2 is that you have more plant material produced.
Increased CO2 worldwide, with few exceptions, means plants grow better, period.
We grow vegetables at 2 till 4 times the outside carbon dioxide level. That means between 700 and 1400 parts per million. We are growing all the vegetables that commercial growers are growing, but the main products are cucumber, tomato, pepper, eggplants, squash, lettuce, and radish. The results of growing at elevated CO2 levels are a more rapid growth, earlier maturity, larger fruit size, greater weight, and a greater total yield of about 25%.
Increased yield is experienced in all food crops when carbon dioxide is increased. Research shows that a doubling of carbon dioxide increases food production dramatically. For instance, a doubling of carbon dioxide will increase cereal crops by 20 to nearly 50%, legumes like peas and beans by 44%, roots and tubers by 40%, and vegetables by 33%. As if that's not enough, carbon dioxide also helps these crops overcome harsh growing conditions such as drought and pollution.
The amount of water that's used by plants to produce the same amount of growth actually decreases with increased CO2.
So a higher water use efficiency means we're using CO2 more efficiently in terms of the water requirements for the crop.
This will change some of the ecosystems. It may allow some plants to grow in areas that now would be considered marginal for the growth of those plants. So we'd have more biomass production, plants in a little bit different area, and we may actually be able to farm some of the areas that would now be considered desert.
Rather than a dangerous pollutant, carbon dioxide could be called a miracle gas that acts like a free fertilizer to help alleviate famine in regions of the world that have frequent droughts and famines, all without causing harm to the environment or people.
Okay, research has shown that increases of CO2 concentration of 2, 3, 4, 5 times would not have a detrimental effect upon the Earth's biosphere.
We go up to about 1,500 parts per million. That has no negative effect on human health. To get negative effects on human health, you have to go much higher. That's higher than 5,000 and 10,000 parts per million, at least. Looking at rising levels of CO2 from the viewpoint of the plant, that's no problem at all. We will have a higher production.
The evidence that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to cause a disaster is somewhere between slim and none. However, the evidence that it's doing a good thing by lengthening the growing season and making plants grow better is somewhere between large and overwhelming.
These scientists have told you the other side of the global warming issue. When debated in a public forum where both sides of the story are told, many people who once believed in man-caused global warming suddenly become skeptics.
There's a reason for this. This happened only last week. There's a debate when it's balanced. And let me make sure we understand. When I talk about skeptics, I'm talking about scientists who believe that the science is not settled. When I talk about alarmists, I'm saying they're the ones who think that it is settled, okay? When the debate is balanced, the skeptics win, the alarmists lose. In New York last week, a major debate took place to examine whether, this is the goal, whether global warming is a crisis. Prior to the debate, the hand-wringers, the alarmists, your guys in the audience, outnumbered those who didn't think it was a crisis by 2 to 1. After the debate, it completely reversed.
The results of our debate. After our debaters did their best to sway you, you went from 30% for the motion that global warming is not a crisis, from 30% to 46%. Against the motion went from 57% to 42%. So, in terms of opinion change, those in favor of the motion have carried the day. Congratulations to the team for the motion.
When people become informed with the information presented in this video, they often become skeptical about the increasingly shrill drumbeat of doom and gloom put forth by Al Gore and the alarmists. The only serious evidence that the alarmists have are the far from perfect global models and the hockey stick curve. And they don't have the hockey stick curve any longer. It has been thoroughly discredited. The rest of the evidence is circumstantial, not unlike the proverbial blind men describing an elephant. They just don't know. No one does.
Trying to understand the causes of climate change is akin to putting together an extraordinarily complex jigsaw puzzle, in which we are still missing many key pieces.
We haven't even got all the edge pieces, and we really haven't got some of the corner pieces. For example, the oceans. Our knowledge about deep ocean circulation, where you can have huge amounts of heat energy stored for up to 10,000 years.
But what they can't have is a situation where people just yank a paper out of the literature without having done any kind of analysis of it or verification of it and say, on this basis, we're going to start spending billions of dollars. That's just a recipe for disaster.
So why do so many scientists adamantly defend the theory of man-caused global warming when the evidence is so weak? In the early 1990s, I led a multi-million-dollar research effort on the effects of global warming on our nation's ecosystems. And what you'll find is about that time is that the government would begin to fund tremendously global warming research. About $2 billion a year then, it's up to $4 billion a year now. There's a whole cadre of scientists out there that are on what's called soft money. If they do not show a global warming connection, they will not get their next grant. And it's been shown time and time again when a scientist basically says, I cannot take this any longer, it's just not happening, they no longer get grants from the federal government, and they're out of a job. Those scientists that are skeptical about man-caused global warming are repeatedly accused of being funded by big oil and industry. Yet the opposite is true.
If industry funding corrupts someone's message, however, I suggest the alarmists have an awful lot of explaining to do. They receive an awful lot more in industry and industry-related funding every year, but let's just make the public record is quite clear. We do not receive lots of money from big oil, and for some reason that seems to be the claim that the alarmists want to shift the debate onto, even though they know the truth there too.
Many of these companies actually play hardball politics to get Congress to spend more money on global warming research and to pass economically damaging legislation. But why?
The cost of global warming is huge. We had a hearing, Mr. Vice President, in this committee where we had many of the companies who came in and were embracing the idea that man-made gases are causing climate change, only to find out that without exception, each one of the 5 companies that was here testifying had to stand, they stood to gain not millions, but in a couple of cases billions of dollars if we should put reductions on, or a cap and trade policy or reductions on CO2.
The question then becomes why? Why does Al Gore use what can only be described as Madison Avenue fear-mongering to try to convince you that the world is going to end unless we ratify the Kyoto Protocol and impose the international solutions to stop man-caused global warming? What possible reason could there be? Congressman Don Young of Alaska provides some insight.
The environment is being used for a power struggle. The environment is being used for centralized government. The environment is being used to make a one-world government. And if you don't think this is not occurring, just see what's happening in the United States. This is an awakening call that we are facing a battle against those that want to destroy a great United States of America.
What troubles me about this is that there is a general tendency, I think, on the part of our leadership that we need to submerge the goals and the sovereignty of the United States to the goals and the sovereignty of the United Nations. I think that there's a real question here about the sovereignty of the United States.
Bill Clinton took office in 1993. He appointed his Rhodes Scholar roommate as his personal foreign policy advisor. Strobe Talbott had spent 22 years as a writer for Time magazine, where his writings revealed his eagerness to get rid of patriotism, American sovereignty, and independence. In the July 20th, 1992 Time, Talbott wrote an article entitled "The Birth of the Global Nation." He enthusiastically predicted that in the next century, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. In fact, wrote Talbott, national sovereignty wasn't such a great idea after all. Talbott bragged about how our national sovereignty and independence have already been diminished by the International Monetary Fund and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT agreements. He boasted that the internal affairs of a nation are no longer off limits to world government. For his article, Talbott received an award from the World Federalist Association, a group committed to world government, and a congratulatory letter from Bill Clinton. Later, President Clinton appointed Strobe Talbott to the #2 post in the U.S. State Department.
Strobe Talbott and those who dream of putting the United States under a single global authority know that Americans will never vote for world government. So instead, they talk about global governance, a global village, a global neighborhood, a global economy, a global commons. That means the sea, the air, and outer space. They talk about reforming the United Nations and expanding NATO. The solution to the problems they raise is always more international agencies wielding more and more control over American land, private property, natural resources, economy, trade, military forces, and even our personal relationships.
Well, of course, these treaties that emanate from the United Nations, they are looking after somebody else's welfare, not the welfare and the rights of the American people.
During the 6th Conference of the Parties for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, held at The Hague in 2000, former French President Jacques Chirac made a startling proclamation. He said, quote, "For the first time, humanity is instituting a genuine instrument of global governance, one that should find a place within the World Environment Organization, which France and the European Union would like to see established. By acting together, by building this unprecedented instrument, the first component of an authentic global governance, we are working for a dialogue of peace." Global governance goes far beyond climate change, however. As Phyllis Schlafly, founder and president of Eagle Forum, has determined, it extends into every aspect of our society through treaties and agreements within the United Nations and other international institutions.
All these treaties are dangerous attacks on American freedoms, national security, land ownership, and private property. Every one of these treaties involves setting up a new global bureaucracy that would have some kind of obnoxious control over American citizens, or our families, or our schools, or our businesses, or our use of natural resources and energy, or our land. And together they add up to what is meant by global governance. Treaties are one road to global governance. United Nations conferences are another. These global conferences pretend to be democratic conventions of representatives of more than 100 nations who come together to vote for plans they all agree on. Nothing could be further from the truth. The policies are all written ahead of time, and the so-called delegates are manipulated to produce what is called consensus. The consensus is never submitted to Congress.
The consensus process was so firmly planted before the meeting even began that the opening day of the conference there was consensus formed. That tells me that the United Nations is not a place for open debate. It is not a place for people to share different ideas and for freedom to reign. It is a place instead where the United Nations has an agenda, and they have set the agenda beforehand, and people come to the table in order to find out what their working orders, what their marching orders are, and then they are to go back home and implement what the UN's agenda is.
That the consensus in Kyoto will bind us to reduce U.S. energy consumption by 1/4, and that would have a devastating effect on America's standard of living and on the ability of U.S. wage earners to support their families.
There are essentially 5 major problems with the Global Warming Treaty as it is now being conceived and probably presented. One, there's no clear, concise science. At best, the science is contradictory, it's inconclusive, it's unclear. Second, the economic consequences. The economic consequences, we know for sure, would be disastrous, would be devastating to this country, driving industries out of this country. We would lose millions of jobs, energy costs would go up, productivity would go down, standard of living would go down. Third, if in fact you want to curb greenhouse gas emissions, you certainly don't do that by binding the developed nations and let all the other countries, 130 of the so-called non-developed countries, including China, India, Mexico, South Korea, and others, off. Fourth, national sovereignty. This cuts right at the heart of national sovereignty of the United States of America. We, in essence, if we signed this treaty, would be saying we would allow an international body to come in and dictate to our industries, our businesses, our people, what they could do and what they couldn't do, use of what energy, which sources of energy, the cost of energy. And fifth, national security implications. If this treaty was signed, it would have disastrous implications on our national security. It would mean that we would have to fly less. We would shut down many of our training programs for tanks, armored vehicles, for ships, and for what? To sign this treaty.
The Kyoto Protocol, for instance, to supposedly solve the global warming issue will not solve global warming. It has nothing to do with actually reducing the carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere. If you know what is actually happening in that, the developing nations, China and Russia and so forth, are not bound by that treaty. They can continue to expand their industry, continue to pollute and so forth forever. And in fact, China is basically going to overtake the emissions of carbon dioxide by the United States within 2 years. And so no effect on those particular nations. They can continue just to increase. Only the developed nations are required to decrease. We have the issue of having to buy carbon credits from those third world nations. So it's a massive income redistribution plan to provide money for these third world nations, and it will not help global warming whatsoever. Even the United Nations admits this. The roots of global governance goes well back over 100 years. In 1966, one of the foremost and unimpeachable American historians of the 20th century, Carroll Quigley, published a book entitled Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. He spent 20 years researching this agenda and found that there was a quiet effort to create world government with a small cadre of people controlling that government. Because he agreed with the goals of the cabal's efforts, Quigley was given access to all the records for a period of 2 years. On page 324 of his 1,300-page magnus opus are these troubling words. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. These private groups, meetings, and conferences still exist today under a cloud of innuendo and conspiracy. They include what is known as the Round Table, which is the core of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs, and many others. Let's just take a look at one of these discussed by Charles Hodgson with CNN's World Business Today in London.
Conspiracy or cozy talking shop? The Bilderberg Group is meeting in South Germany this week, at least according to the Financial Times, which says a group of powerful men and women will debate the future of the world. The paper says the steering committee of Bilderberg includes Deutsche Bank boss Josef Ackermann, Nokia CEO Jorma Ollila, Daimler Chrysler's Jürgen Schrempp, and outgoing World Bank President James Wolfensohn. I asked John Ronson, who has written about Bilderberg, what it really is.
Bilderberg is a meeting of powerful centrist industrialists and politicians. They always meet in secret once a year in a five-star hotel with golfing facilities, and they've taken on the image for conspiracy theorists of the fabled shadowy cabal that secretly rules the world.
Are they?
Well, yes and no. I mean,
they're a bunch of powerful people. They meet in secret. They say we meet in private, which isn't quite the same thing, is it?
It's not quite the same thing. I do think that by and large, many members of the Bilderberg Group actually see themselves in much the same way as the conspiracy theorists see them, as this shadowy cabal out to, if not to rule the world, but to influence world events.
What would they see as their purpose then? I mean, presumably it's a good get-together of powerful people. They don't often get a chance to meet away from the glare of the press. One can understand why they might want to have a private chat.
Yeah, and that's certainly got something to do with it. They see themselves as wise globalist centrists. They were set up post the Second World War by people like Dennis Healey, David Rockefeller and various others. And
there's a degree of idealism there, isn't there? They didn't want to go to war again. I mean...
Oh, absolutely.
Is that a sinister conspiracy?
Well, I mean, it depends what side of the political spectrum you sit on. And many of the anti-Bilderberg conspiracists are right-wingers who see themselves as twigs in a tidal wave of globalization. They see themselves as nationalists, and they think the idea of a world government, which is what Bilderberg is into by and large, the idea of a one world community, a new world order. They see that as
they see themselves as a government as opposed to a group of world leaders or people with influence at a global level who are talking about global issues, do they?
They see themselves as headhunters. They'll get an up-and-coming politician who they think may be president or prime minister one day, and as globalist industrialist leaders who believe that politics shouldn't be in the hands of the politicians.
The globalists involved in creating world control have historically called their efforts the New World Order since the early part of the 20th century. President George H. Bush used it publicly during the first Gulf War.
Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. Now we can see a new world coming into view. A world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order.
The name New World Order raised so many red flags that it was dropped almost as soon as President Bush uttered them during the first Gulf War. The Commission on Global Governance was immediately formed with the full blessing of the United Nations. Its report was released in 1994 and published as Our Global Neighborhood in 1995. The report provides a flexible set of justifications and implementation goals needed to implement global governance. The report acknowledges that the environment is key to forming global governance. It states that considerable strides have been made in creating a system of international environmental governance to achieve global sustainable development through the management of cross-border environmental disputes and protection of the global commons. Man-caused global warming fits perfectly within international environmental governance. The report recommends, quote, a carbon tax would no doubt be a valuable step forward towards a radically different system, one that taxes resource use rather than employment through payroll taxes and savings. This would recognize the need to discourage excessive consumption and would stimulate employment as part of a strategy of sustainable development, unquote. That is exactly what Al Gore and other alarmists are saying today. Somehow, they claim, more taxes are going to help our economy.
Yes, I know that CO2 tax is considered just wildly unrealistic now, but, our pattern of financing our social programs and health and welfare programs on the backs of employment has outlived its rationality and usefulness.
See the payroll tax?
Yeah, sharply reduce or eliminate, absolutely, and replace it with a pollution-based tax system, principally CO2. I fully understand how inaccessible that sounds in this context. I really believe that would help our economy, help our competitiveness, and I think it would put incentives in place to do the right thing.
Regardless of Al Gore's assurances, making everything more expensive because of a carbon tax cannot help our economy or individual families, nor can a cap-and-trade scheme that is also promoted by Gore and other alarmists. The Congressional Budget Office warned that such efforts would be, and I quote, regressive in that poor households would bear a larger burden relative to their income than the wealthier households would, unquote. Indeed, such a plan would be disastrous to the American people. This is exactly what historian Carroll Quigley meant when he stated that, quote, in this group of globalists were persons whose lives have been a disaster to our way of life, unquote. How does this work? When he was vice president, Al Gore called it reinventing government through the creation of public-private partnerships. You have heard this phrase many times on the news, but didn't know what it really means. There are literally thousands of these public-private partnerships in the United States and around the world. The problem with public-private partnerships is that they shift decision-making from the electorate and elected officials to an unaccountable partnership of non-governmental organizations, government bureaucracies, and multinational corporations at the international, national, and local levels. Since none of these entities are elected and government bureaucracies are only marginally accountable to the electorate, the partnerships are free to impose their will on people, not unlike the feudal system, just as historian Carroll Quigley said in his book, Tragedy and Hope. All of this is driven by the deliberately fabricated need for what is called sustainable development, which include things like smart growth and environmental protection. The latter includes the Kyoto Protocol to ostensibly reduce global warming, but in fact allows control of our economy by international bureaucracies that will impose carbon taxes and cap and trade schemes, exactly as the Commission on Global Governance and Al Gore propose. The partnerships form a neo-fascist relationship between government and corporations, which creates monopolies, effectively eliminating most competition from small businesses that do not have the ability to meet the draconian regulations. Once this process is fully in place, there is no longer free market enterprise, but total economic control. Again, this is exactly what Carroll Quigley said would happen in Tragedy and Hope. It is what is meant by global governance and the New World Order. Lou Dobbs of CNN provides an excellent snapshot of how this is being done today and its terrible consequences on the middle class.
Tonight, a proposal for an expanded so-called free trade zone from Alaska to the tip of South America. It's a plan from the business elites, the political elites, that will cost more American jobs, cost American sovereignty, but it would fulfill the president's father's vision. Bill Tucker reports.
It's not a new idea. President Bush talked about it back in 1991.
It is a big idea, a new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause.
Now, former United States Trade Ambassador Robert Zoellick is talking about it again with renewed vigor. This time, a new world order with business at the helm of trade and economic policy, advocating what he calls the Association of American Free Trade Agreements, a separate non-government entity which would include North, Central, and South America.
What Zoellick is really proposing here is a stealth trade agenda. It's not a national agenda. He's proposing to set up what's essentially a private organization to try to achieve what he couldn't get done when he was the U.S. trade representative. And this is a business agenda.
It's an agenda that goes hand in hand with the United States, Mexico, and Canada, working quietly and behind the scenes to promote a common market with common deregulation for the benefit of multinational corporations. It's an agenda that so far has resulted in an increase in U.S. corporate profits of 45%, while wages of American workers have risen only 3% in the last 5 years.
The main danger raised by Zoellick's proposals is that the future of American international economic policy, which affects not only our nation's prosperity, but its national security, will be set not by the American people and their elected representatives, but by a small corporate elite that is accountable to no one but itself.
Effectively surrendering the sovereignty of the United States. And as justification for trusting those who would have the authority, the argument is made that free trade promotes democracy and the welfare of the people. But Lou, one has to look no further than China to see whether that, in fact, is true.
You know, talking about Zoellick's proposal, it's not Zoellick's proposal, it's Daddy's proposal. And people better understand that they mean exactly what they're saying. It's a new world order they're trying to create, and they're trying to do so not only without approval or consent of the governed in this country, but despite the popular will. This is a straightforward assault by the elitists in this country.
Robert Zoellick, the architect of the Association of American Free Trade Agreements mentioned in Lou Dobbs' story, is one of the many power brokers heavily involved in advancing the New World Order and global governance. In May of 2007, President Bush nominated him to be the next president of the World Bank, where he will have the quiet power to implement many of his ideas, including the new proposal advanced by President Bush at the G8 meeting in June 2007.
So my proposal is this. By the end of next year, America and other nations will set a long-term global goal for reducing greenhouse gases. To help develop this goal, the United States would convene a series of meetings of nations that produced most greenhouse gas emissions, including nations with rapidly growing economies like India and China.
Although the Bush climate plan is far superior than the Kyoto Protocol, it still begs the question, if the probability that increasing carbon dioxide will result in potentially tremendous benefits for mankind and the environment, why pursue the reduction of carbon dioxide at all? Could it be because it establishes a huge international bureaucracy which is not accountable to the citizens of the United States and the world? That is very, very clear in these United Nations documents that they want to set up a regulatory structure that would affect every man, woman, and child on planet Earth, and all of the control would be headquartered in the United Nations. And if we take the more recent United Nations documents, it's going to be called the Trusteeship Council in the restructure of the United Nations that's occurring right now. While these plans are being made for everyone else, those demanding that we make these sacrifices have no intention of making the same sacrifices themselves.
All right, now I'd like to put up the little pledge thing here. I'm going to ask you if you would like to commit here today. You know how many hundreds of thousands of fans you have out there that would like to follow your lead. And this pledge merely says, as you can read it up there, that you're agreeing to consume no more energy in your residence than the average American household by 1 year from today. Not right now. You got a whole year to look to try to do this. Now, the one thing I'd like to have you not use in response to this question, which is a yes or no question, is the various gimmicks. Now, I have something I want to submit for the record, Madam Chairman, that talks about the effects, the offsets, and the credits are gimmicks used by the wealthy, so they don't have to change their lifestyles. And I have an article that is last Sunday's United Kingdom Times. I'd like to add, submit for the record at this time.
You may.
All right. What's your answer?
Purchase wind energy and other green energy that does not produce carbon dioxide. And that does cost a little more now, and that is one of the reasons why it costs a little more.
In fact, Al Gore uses 17 times more electricity than the average American. The average American uses 11,256 kilowatts annually, while the Gores use an almost unbelievable 191,000 kilowatts. Yet Al Gore casually justifies this because he uses green energy that only the rich can afford. That kind of hypocrisy is not confined to the Gores. Actor John Travolta also claims that we should all sacrifice in order that we reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Yet he owns 5 airplanes that he can use to jet around the world, all parked within walking distance of his home in Florida. Listen to what the author of State of Fear and movie producer Michael Crichton says about this hypocrisy during the March 2007 Intelligence Squared debate.
Actually, all anybody really wants to do is talk about it. They don't actually do anything. And the evidence for that is the number of major leaders in climate who clearly have no intention of changing their lifestyle, reducing their own consumption, or getting off private jets themselves. If they're not willing to do it, why should anybody else? Let's have the NRDC, the Sierra Club, and Greenpeace make it a rule that all of their members cannot fly on private jets. They must get their houses off the grid. They must live in the way that they're telling everyone else to live. And if they won't do that, why should we? And why should we take them seriously?
Whether we move left or right or center, the destiny of our country ought to be determined by Americans. And to see our own leaders surrendering that sovereignty to global institution, it seems to me it really approaches a sellout and a betrayal of the Founding Fathers and of the idea for which America was founded.
What you have seen in this video is only a small part of the evidence that the current warming of the Earth is natural. We hope this evidence has helped you understand both sides of this critical issue. We hope you ask yourself why the global warming alarmists try to convince you that the ice core data shows that carbon dioxide levels have controlled the Earth temperature in the past, when most of the time temperature preceded the carbon dioxide levels, or why the troposphere is not warming according to what the carbon dioxide warming theory states it must. Then ask yourself why there is not a good correlation between carbon dioxide levels and the temperature when there is very good correlation between solar or cosmic radiation levels and temperature. Finally, ask yourself why you are never told that much higher levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide could provide a huge benefit to people in the Earth's environment. On the other hand, there is strong evidence that an elite is using global warming as one of the many tools to impose global governance in the United States and around the world. If successful, this agenda promises to bring wealth and power to a global elite and transnational corporations at a terrible expense to the average person, just like you. We ask that you think hard on the choices that this nation will be making in the near future, and then contact your senator and congressman to let them know what you believe is the right thing to do.